Most people think their 30s become expensive because of mortgages, children, or rising responsibilities. But those are not the real costs. The most expensive bill arrives long before that. It is the accumulated price of decisions nobody seemed to care about in your 20s. Because life has a strange habit. It gives you freedom first and sends the invoice later. Most people are taught to think about their 30s in a very simple way. This is supposed to be the decade when life gets expensive. You buy a home, you raise children, you support aging parents, you take on more responsibilities at work. Naturally, your expenses increase. And on the surface, that explanation makes perfect sense. After all, when people talk about financial pressure in their 30s and 40s, they usually point to the visible costs: the mortgage payment, the school tuition, the medical bills, the lifestyle that becomes harder and harder to maintain. But there is a problem with that explanation. Those costs affect almost everyone. Yet two people with similar incomes, similar responsibilities, and similar opportunities can arrive at age 35 living completely different lives. One feels stable and in control. The other feels trapped, constantly behind, and overwhelmed by pressure. If the visible costs are similar, then something else must be creating the difference. And that difference often begins years before the bills ever arrive. The real issue is not that life becomes more expensive after 30. It's that life becomes more honest. In your 20s, reality gives you a grace period. You can waste time, switch directions, ignore opportunities, neglect your health, spend beyond your means, and often suffer very little immediate consequence. The gap between cause and effect is large enough to hide the damage. But by the time you reach your 30s, that gap begins to close. The skills you failed to build become limitations. The money you failed to save becomes pressure. The relationships you failed to nurture become isolation. And the habits you thought were harmless begin presenting a bill. What feels like a sudden crisis is often something much simpler. Reality is not punishing you. Reality is collecting. And once you begin to see that pattern, many things that once felt random start making sense. This is mind over system, where we break down the hidden systems and ideas that shape the outcomes of our lives. The first mechanism behind the high cost of your 30s is something most people underestimate: small decisions. Not dramatic decisions, not life-changing decisions, small ones. The problem is that humans are naturally attracted to immediate consequences. We notice a broken bone. We notice a lost job. We notice a financial crisis. What we rarely notice are decisions that produce no visible consequence today. Reading one less book, skipping one workout, delaying one important skill, spending money that could have been invested. None of these actions feel expensive in the moment. In fact, they often feel harmless. And that is exactly why they are dangerous. Because life does not charge for these decisions immediately. It puts them on a tab. For years, the cost remains hidden. Then, one day, two people with similar intelligence and similar opportunities arrive at age 35. One possesses valuable skills. The other is struggling to stay relevant. One has financial flexibility. The other lives paycheck to paycheck. One has options. The other has obligations. The difference was not created in a single year. It was created through thousands of invisible decisions that quietly compounded in the background while nobody was paying attention. The second mechanism is not personal. It is social. Most people think the pressure of their 30s comes from within, but much of it comes from a change in how the world responds to them. When you are 22, society gives you something valuable: potential. People assume you are still learning, still exploring, still figuring things out. Mistakes are expected. Uncertainty is tolerated. Failure is often dismissed with a simple explanation: they're still young. But that perception does not last forever. As you move into your 30s, the world gradually becomes less interested in your potential and more interested in your results. Employers care less about what you might become and more about what you can already do. Business partners care less about your ambitions and more about your track record. Even relationships begin to operate under a different set of expectations. The reason many people experience their mid-30s as a crisis is not because they suddenly became less capable. It is because the rules quietly changed. For years, society extended credit based on possibility. Now it starts asking for proof. And if the foundations were never built, the pressure feels overwhelming. Not because the world became cruel, but because the grace period has ended. The third mechanism is perhaps the most unsettling. Time itself begins to feel different. Ask someone in their late teens about 10 years. It feels enormous, a lifetime, a distant future that barely seems real. But ask someone who is 35. 10 years suddenly feels frighteningly short. And that shift changes everything. The reason is not just psychological. It is structural. As we age, our lives become more interconnected. A decision is no longer just a decision. Changing careers affects income. Income affects family. Family affects location. Location affects opportunities. Every choice becomes attached to a network of consequences. The freedom of youth comes partly from having fewer connections. The responsibilities of adulthood come from having many. And that creates a strange phenomenon. The older you become, the more expensive each year becomes. Not because time moves faster, but because every year carries more weight. At 22, wasting a year often feels recoverable. At 38, a wasted year can mean a delayed retirement, a missed opportunity, a weakened career position, or another year spent living a life that no longer fits who you have become. This is why so many people feel a sudden urgency in their 30s. For the first time, they begin to understand that time is not being spent. It is being converted into skills, into health, into wealth, into relationships, or into their absence. And once you see time that way, your 30s stop looking like a decade. They start looking like a deadline. You can see this pattern almost everywhere once you know what to look for. Look at the people who seem to gain momentum as they move through their 30s. Rarely did their success appear overnight. What looks like a sudden breakthrough is often the visible result of a decade of invisible preparation. The same pattern appears in reverse. Many financial struggles that emerge in the late 30s are not created by a single bad year. They are often the accumulated result of years of postponed decisions, neglected skills, rising lifestyle costs, and a lack of long-term planning. The modern economy amplifies this effect even further. Technology changes industries faster than ever. Skills become outdated more quickly. Competition becomes increasingly global. The people who continuously adapt tend to accumulate advantages. Those who remain static often discover that standing still is no longer neutral. It is a form of falling behind. This is why the gap between individuals often widens with age. Not because life becomes unfair, but because time exposes what has been compounding beneath the surface all along. Picture two friends standing at the same starting line. They are both 25. They earn roughly the same salary. They have similar dreams, similar energy, and the same comforting belief that life is still ahead of them. 10 years pass, not in dramatic leaps, but in ordinary Tuesdays, routine mornings, forgotten weekends, years so unremarkable that neither of them notices what is being built beneath the surface. The first spends most of his income because there will always be another paycheck. He postpones difficult decisions because there will always be another year. He tells himself that once life settles down, he will finally get serious. The second does not live like a monk. He still enjoys life, still makes mistakes, still wastes time from time to time. But every year, he leaves something behind that his future self can use. A new skill, a stronger network, a healthier body, a larger financial cushion. Nothing impressive enough to post online. Nothing dramatic enough for other people to notice. Then one morning, they both wake up at 38. For the first time, the invisible becomes visible. One sees opportunities. The other sees limitations. One experiences pressure as a challenge. The other experiences pressure as a threat. And suddenly, what looked like two similar lives no longer look similar at all. The tragedy is that neither of them became this person overnight. They simply spent 10 years becoming who they were becoming. And this is where the conversation becomes much bigger than personal responsibility. Because what happens to those two individuals is not happening in isolation. It is happening across entire societies. For most of human history, people lived in relatively stable environments. Skills remained useful for decades. Communities stayed together. Careers followed predictable paths. The gap between falling behind and catching up was often manageable. Today, that gap is expanding. Technology evolves faster. Industries transform faster. Information spreads faster. Competition arrives from every corner of the world. The modern economy rewards accumulation more aggressively than ever before. A small advantage, repeated for 10 years, becomes a massive advantage. A small neglect, repeated for 10 years, becomes a serious disadvantage. This is why so many people feel an invisible pressure in their 30s and 40s. They are not only competing against other people, they are competing against time itself. Every year, the world keeps moving. Skills lose value. Industries shift. Opportunities disappear. New opportunities emerge for those who prepared before they arrived. What makes this reality so unsettling is that the system rarely announces the change. There is no warning letter, no alarm, no official moment when life tells you that the cost of waiting has increased. One day you simply realize that the choices available at 25 are no longer available at 35. And that realization can feel like waking up inside a game whose rules changed while you were busy playing it. The most expensive decade of life is not expensive because everything costs more. It is expensive because the price of delay becomes impossible to ignore. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding about life is the belief that consequences arrive when the damage is done. They don't. Consequences arrive when the damage becomes visible. That is why so many people are shocked by their 30s. They believe life changed suddenly. In reality, life was changing the entire time. The only difference is that the hidden processes have finally surfaced. A tree does not become weak on the day it falls. A business does not collapse on the day it closes its doors. A relationship does not break on the day someone leaves. The visible event is usually the end of a process that began long before anyone noticed. Human lives work the same way. What makes your 30s feel expensive is not the presence of consequences. It is the visibility of consequences. For the first time, the connection between past decisions and present reality becomes difficult to ignore. And that is why this decade feels so different. Not because life is becoming unfair, not because the world is targeting you, but because reality is finally removing the distance between action and outcome. Your 30s are not the decade when life starts keeping score. They are the decade when you finally get to see the scoreboard. The value of understanding this is not to create fear. It is to create clarity. Because once you recognize how life actually works, you stop treating the future as something that simply happens to you. You begin to see it as something that is quietly being constructed in the present. Every skill learned, every relationship strengthened, every habit repeated, every decision postponed. None of these moments seem important on their own. Yet together, they become the architecture of a life. The truth is that most people never notice the system while they are inside it. They only notice the outcomes after years of accumulation. But awareness changes the way you see time, not as something to spend, not as something to chase, but as something constantly being converted into a future reality. And whether that reality becomes a burden or an advantage is often determined long before it becomes visible. Maybe that is why the years between 30 and 40 feel so expensive. Not because life suddenly becomes harder, not because the world suddenly becomes unfair, but because this is often the first decade when reality becomes impossible to negotiate with. The choices you made, the habits you repeated, the opportunities you ignored, the foundations you built or failed to build, all of them begin to appear in plain sight. And perhaps the most important question is not whether the bill has arrived. The question is, if your life today is a reflection of what has been compounding beneath the surface for the last 10 years, what is quietly compounding right now?